video, hopefully trying to finish up chapter 10, where we are talking about the history of education. In our last video, we got into trends in elementary education, how that influenced the progressive philosophy that we see today, that a lot of teachers, especially in elementary education, do end up having. And so I want us to talk about secondary education and how it's been impacted across our country, about how it's been impacted by several other things to kind of become what it is today. So what we think about as our secondary schools, our junior highs, and our high schools are not the way that it started. Okay, so for example, the high schools that we have today have sort of evolved from these types of schools that you see here. So the first one being the Latin grammar schools. This was one of the earliest secondary institutions, and it was primarily a college prep school. So getting students ready to go to college. Okay, there was an act, a law in 1647 called the Old Deluder Satan Act. Okay, Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647, which required communities of 50 or more families to establish elementary schools. Okay, that's why I mentioned the 50 students earlier in the previous video, because this act required, if you had 50 families that could gather together, then their kids would be educated in an elementary school based on this act. And the reason it's called this act, the Old Deluder Satan Act, is because the idea was we're going to teach these students religion as part of their core curriculum so that basically Satan doesn't work his way into our children's lives. Now, we know that's not necessarily the case, but that was the idea behind it. Well, this act also said that if there were 100 or more families, then communities had to create a Latin school for these students that would want to go on to college. And so this was the first type of secondary school that we see in the United States. But then you begin to have English grammar schools. And as the growth of the middle class businesses began, you needed schools that taught more general and practical curriculum. Everything from navigation to engineering to bookkeeping to foreign languages, all of those things needed to be taught. And so you begin to have private English grammar schools where those things were taught. Those students were typically going to be the ones who were not going to go to college. It was primarily preparing them to go get a job. You had a lot of commercial, what they considered commercial subjects that were taught as opposed to religious subjects. And even things like music and art and dancing, those were not considered to be practical, but they actually trained students for socializing in polite company. And so those were classes that were also taught. You also had females begin to start going to school. The girls typically would study the 3 R's, as we've mentioned: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And again, writing and arithmetic don't start with R, but they called them the 3 R's. Our book has it written as reading, writing without the W, and then arithmetic without the A. And they also even were taught geography and even some French in some of their schools, along with maybe some history. And then you also might have things like English grammar and Latin. And so you begin to have females being a little more educated. And a lot of the females would practice things like bookkeeping and they would begin to get skills like that, so they could go get jobs as well. The next type of secondary school we had were the academies, and this was a new type. It was really became popular during the second half of the 18th century, and it sort of attempted to combine the Latin and the English grammar schools. So the Latin grammar school was college prep. The English grammar school was more commercialized. Let's maybe not vocational is not necessarily the right word for that, but it was more, let's prepare you to be able to go work, right? And so the academies began to kind of mesh the two, and it became a school that was available for, again, in a private setting. You couldn't just anybody go to an academy. It was a private school, but it did begin to kind of mesh the grammar, Latin grammar and English grammar schools. There was also a surge in the academies in the first half of the 1800s, where you begin to see females that were going to academies as well. And so, really, the women education movement, it began really for two purposes. Number one was to produce women who could handle the domestic chores and challenges of wives and mothers intellectually and wisely, so that, as our book quotes, they could become companions rather than satellites of their husbands. So instead of the husband having to be the one that was educated and make all the decisions, the woman was now going to be intelligent and wise because she's getting this education, and so she's going to be able to have an intelligent say in making decisions and being a parent and a wife and all those things. The second reason that women were beginning to be educated was so that they could prepare to go be teachers. That's one of the reasons that teaching primarily for years has been considered a female job. A lot of females will go into education, and it's been that way because when especially secondary schools started, the females that were going through school were going to be teachers. It wasn't until much more recently that you had women that said, well, I don't want to teach. I want to do something else. I want to have a career. I want to run a business. I want to do other things. And so you begin to see in the academies, you begin to see women getting an education so they could then go be a teacher themselves. And then we have the public high schools, which is a little more common to us. It's sort of similar to what we see now. In 1821, in Boston, the first English high school was created. There was a second one for girls in 1826. And unlike the academies, the high schools were governed by the public rather than private school boards. So the academies had a private school board that governed them. The public schools were governed by the public, right? Taxpayers and that kind of thing. And so in 1874, there was a famous lawsuit called the Kalamazoo case. Let me write that down so you can see. Make sure I spell it right. Kalamazoo. The Kalamazoo case. And this was a case from a financial standpoint that was really, really important. It was in Michigan, and the courts in Michigan ruled that the school district could tax the public to support both high schools and elementary schools. And so this was the first time that you began to see taxpayers actually funding education. Again, this is in 1874. And so ever since, the public, taxpayers, have paid or financed our public education. And so you begin to see that there. And then we have what is known as the comprehensive high school. That's what primarily our high schools in this area are going to have. It is a really a more well-rounded curriculum. It embodies the notion that all those themes that we talked about of American education in that first section, it sort of embodies all those, where we train people in vocation. We also train people to get ready to go to college. And you get a comprehensive, and everybody gets a comprehensive education that's going to cover things like math and science and language and history and all your basic core subjects. But it's also going to carry over and give you the opportunity, if you want to learn things like typing, which was something that I took in like the 8th grade. We had to learn how to type. I don't know when you learn how to type, but that's a skill that people need, and so you can learn those things. It may be some type of law class where you begin to learn about law or economics, or you could even get manual training, like working with metal or wood, or working on a car, and those types of things. So this comprehensive high school offers so much, from the academics that are more going to prepare you for college, but also the vocational things that are going to prepare you to go into the workforce. And so we begin to see this as we go through our secondary schools. Now, another common thing that we have now are junior high and middle schools. Okay, this has not always been the case. So in the 1909, 1910, you had the first junior high. And the junior high grades at the time were 7, 8, and 9. Now, if I were to ask you, and normally I do this when we're in the classroom together, tell me the grades of your junior high. Most of you are going to probably say 7th and 8th, or 6th, 7th, and 8th. Very rarely does somebody throw in a 9th grade. When I was in junior high, when I started junior high in the 7th grade, our junior high was 7th, 8th, and 9th. By the time I got to the 9th grade, my class was the first freshman class at the high school. The high school had been grades 10 through 12, and then the 9th grade, the year I moved into the 9th grade was the first year 9th graders were at the high school. And so in Itawamba County, that's become a very recent thing. In other schools, 9th grade had been with the high school for a while. And so a lot of schools have 7th and 8th grade. Some will have 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, which is growing more popular as the years go by. And so I think it's interesting to see what schools do what with these grades. For example, I know that Tupelo has a 6th grade. Every student in Tupelo School District goes to the 6th grade together. And then they go to 7th and 8th grade together at a different school. And then they go to the high school. And so you have a separation in 6th, and then you have 7th and 8th, and then 9 through 12. And some school districts do that. Some don't. Some school districts will call 7th and 8th a middle school. Some call them junior highs. One of the funny things about Pontotoc, my wife used to teach there, they used to be in the junior high grades, 7 and 8, they used to be called the middle school. And one time the cheerleaders at the football game started saying, "Go PMS" for Pontotoc Middle School, right? Well, a bunch of cheerleaders, 7th and 8th grade cheerleaders, screaming "Go PMS" is just not the best look. And so they said, we need to change that. Let's make 7th and 8th the junior high, and we'll have 5th and 6th be middle school. And so that's the way it is at Pontotoc. A lot of other schools will still do junior high. Some will do middle school. I believe in New Albany, when I was working there, it was New Albany Middle School was the 7th and 8th, and it may have been 6th, 7th, and 8th. And so you have this separation with these groups, which is a good thing, in my opinion. But you've got people that criticize separating the elementary, high school, and then having this one group for 7th and 8th grade. And so some of those criticisms are that there's too much focus on the developmental side of these students, and so their academics is weak. Now, that's not always the case, because I can tell you, at the school where my wife works, their academics in junior high is known for being very, very tough. Because, number one, they don't want students going into high school and then being unsuccessful and dropping out because they couldn't do the work that they should have learned how to do in junior high. So they're very, very tough in junior high at her school because they expect them to be able to go into high school if they get through their class and be successful. And so the academic side is not weak at all. In fact, it's very, very strong. And so that's one of the criticisms, though, is that, well, you got so much development, you got hormones, you've got puberty, you've got all these things happening, and so these students just need a little extra. They need more focus on their developmental side, and so we're not going to be as tough on them academically. If they don't get some things, they just don't get it. It's not a big deal. And obviously you can see where that's a problem from an academic standpoint. Other people say it's socially unhelpful. And I would disagree with that because I feel like if you have, let's say, an 8th grader in the same school as a 1st grader, well, developmentally, they are in completely different places. And that 8th grader that now it has hormones running through their veins don't necessarily need to be where they have access to younger kids that are not at that same developmental level, if that makes sense. And so I personally see it as a helpful thing to have that group of students separated together, whether you do 7 and 8 only, 7, 8, 9, or even 6, 7, 8. I see a need for keeping that group together socially. And so I think it is a good thing. And then you also have people that want to say, well, it ought to be 7 through 8 and then high school, 9 through 12. And again, I feel like there's, that 7th and 8th grade student probably doesn't need to be able to have access easily to kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade students because they are so different. And so a lot of times those older students don't even want to be at the same school with that younger group. Sometimes, if you have a child that has failed maybe a couple times and now they're still in the 8th grade and they should be a 10th grader and they're at the same school as a kindergartner, that maybe could be a problem. That could be a dangerous situation potentially. So there's a lot of things happening there where it is good to have a separate group. And so I personally think it is good to separate them. A lot of schools now, especially in our area, will buy one huge piece of land and in different buildings have elementary, and then on the same campus but in a different building have the junior high, and then maybe at the same campus in a different building you have the high school. And so that can be helpful because that separates those groups enough where you're not having interaction with those students. And just like I don't think a 7th and 8th grader needs to be able to run around with the kindergarten 1st grader necessarily, I also don't think a 7th grader is ready to be hanging around a high schooler, a 12th grader. I think there's too much difference there between their developments. And so that 7th and 8th grade is it's such a transition time for a kid that in my opinion, it is good to have them separated. So as we continue on talking about different things that have influenced education, private school or private education is one that is has become pretty popular. A lot of times, private schools are used to provide an alternative for public schools because parents want religion taught or some type of religious instruction taught. A lot of times, the wealthy don't want their kids to be in school with people that aren't of the same social class or the same race or the same whatever. And so, a lot of times, if they're wealthy and can afford it, they'll say, well, we want our kids to go to a private school. Others may just be unsatisfied with the public school and say, well, I just don't want my kid to go there. And so I don't have another option, so I'm going to send them to a private school. That happens a lot too. And in our area, we do have some public schools. The most common one that a lot of people go to, is TCPS, Tupelo Christian Preparatory School. And a lot of those people go for some of these same reasons. And so you can talk to people that have gone there, and if you talk to parents about why they sent their kids there, a lot of times it falls into one of these three things. Either they just want some religion taught, or they're wealthy and just feel like they're kind of better than other people and don't want their kids being around the kids they would be in school with in a public school. Or sometimes they just don't think the education's very good and they want an alternative. They're just not satisfied with what's happening. And so private schools are growing. There's a lot of them. There's over 28,000 private schools in the United States. And they enroll 5.1 million students, which is about 10% of the U.S. student population. The predominant religion that's taught is the Catholic religion. Excuse me. About 2.3 million of these students are going to a private Catholic school. And a lot of times, parents may want some religion taught, but they don't necessarily agree with that religious background, that religious belief. So, you may have a kid that goes to a Catholic school, but they may not be Catholic. And so a lot of times students go to these schools and there is some religion being taught, but it's not necessarily the religion that family follows or believes. So that's always kind of an odd thing. So let me ask you this, and this may be something that I put as a discussion board question. What is the negative of private schools? Because there definitely are some positives. There can be a ton of positives, actually. But there's also some negatives. And it goes more than to just the cost of going, because that is a negative. It does cost the parents a good bit of money to send a kid to private school. But from the educational standpoint, what are some negatives that you think you might see in a private school? So I'll leave that open, give you something to think about. I'll probably use this as a discussion board question for this chapter, because I think that is something that we need to consider. From a teacher standpoint, if you were going to be a teacher there, what would be a negative? There's a big negative from you being a teacher there, and that is that you're not in the state retirement system. We've talked before about how Mississippi retirement is really, really good. And if you go into the private sector, well, you're not getting that state retirement. And so that's a negative from you as a teacher. But I'm talking more on the educational side. What can be a negative about the education that students receive at private school? So again, I'll leave that open. I'll answer that in our discussion boards. But I'm going to leave that open to you to think about. And so the last couple of things here, we're going to talk about different minority groups getting access to education. And the first group is African Americans. Before the Civil War, you had religious motivations for sending African Americans to school to teach them about religion. And when I think about African Americans receiving education for the first time, again, I think about that maybe Remember the Titans, because you do see a segregation and then you see a desegregation throughout that movie. And so if you get past the football part of it, just how those students came together and worked together and didn't like each other for a while, and then just that dynamic is really interesting to see, but it kind of helps us to picture what this is like. And so late in the 19th century, African American enrollment in schools, which had only been about 2% of school-age children in 1850, reached about 35% by 1890. And so you begin to see many more students being educated. In the past, you oftentimes, and even today, sometimes, and this is by far not the only case here, but a lot of times you'll see some African Americans who struggle in school. And I almost wonder if it's because some of their family didn't have access to education, 2 or 3 generations ago, and now that they have access to it, they're not as prepared at home for that. Now, nowadays, most African Americans have multiple generations that went to school, and that's not the case. But years and years ago, you had a lot of African Americans that were not successful in school. And so it could have very easily been because they were denied access until the late 1800s. So you think about 130 years ago, we're now in 2020, right? So 130 years ago, you had only 35% of African Americans that were receiving any kind of education, formal education. And so when you think about that in perspective, compared to the white race and how much education they were getting, well, the percentage is much higher. And so you can imagine that then that's going to have a trickle-down effect over many, many years. And so I don't know that that's the case. It is something that I sort of think about as I think about the history. And let me be very, very clear. Education is for everybody. We need everybody to be educated. We want them all to have, everybody to have success. Whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics, whatever. If they're living in America, we want them to be in school and we want them to have success. And so this is not to say that, any one race is smarter than the other or does better than the other, because I've had some African American students who were some of my best students. And, a lot of times it depends on who's going to work hard, who's going to do what, really do what they are required to do to be successful. In fact, this class that you're currently taking kind of started with an African American student that I had that wanted to be a teacher. And he wanted to be able to go observe in a classroom. And so I set him up with an elementary school teacher to go observe. And he went and observed a few times during the semester. And that's where the idea for this class really began, was allowing students who wanted to major in education a chance to go observe. And it all started with him. And so I think that's a really cool thing to think about, where education has gone from before the Civil War to where it is now. And so in the late 19th century, Booker T. Washington, most of you are probably familiar with him from Tuskegee, Alabama. He was, in 1881, he was working with students, and he believed in the idea of learning by doing. And so what he did was he instructed his students to build the schools themselves. Now, teaching African American students, right? He taught them to, he encouraged them to build the school themselves. And in this process, they learned practical skills that they grew produce, they could sell to the white community, and in general showed the whites that African Americans could be productive members of society. That is amazing to me, that he takes a group of students and says, let's show these people that don't believe we can do anything how valuable we are and how productive we can be in society. And so he takes this group of students and they do that. Another major thing that happened in the education for African Americans was what is known as the Morrill Act. So in 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Act. This legislation granted each state a minimum of 30,000 acres of federal land with the provision that income from rent or sale of these lands would be used to establish colleges for the study of agriculture and mechanical arts. So schools that are A&M are agricultural and mechanical arts. For example, Texas A&M. That was the school that was established under this act in Texas. Mississippi State used to be Mississippi A&M. That was the school that was established under this act. That's why Mississippi State is more centrally located in Mississippi as opposed to Ole Miss that's in the north part versus Southern in the southern part, because it was federally owned land that was given to be able to start a college. Michigan State is another example. University of Illinois. All of those schools started as A&M schools. And so I think Auburn in Alabama was an A&M school. And so you had a lot of these schools that were established as a way to study agricultural and mechanical arts. And in 1890, Congress took this Morrill Act, actually made a second one that increased the endowment of land to the original land grant colleges, but forbade the granting money to the college with an admission policy that discriminated against non-whites unless a separate facility for African Americans existed nearby. Now, here's the key to this. This second Morrill Act provided federal support to states to create, quote, separate but equal colleges for African Americans. So essentially, when this act started, the states were taking this land, they were creating these colleges, and if they were not allowing anybody that's considered a non-white, so African Americans or any other race that you might have, if they were discriminating against those groups, the federal government said, we're taking the money back. Unless you can provide an institution or a building, a college that is equal, separate but equal. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute. And in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. You need to make sure you write this one down. Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld that it was constitutional to have separate but equal accommodations for African Americans. Okay? Separate but equal. And so these institutions that were separate but equal were what were known as 1890 institutions. They were created to provide higher education, college education for African Americans. Okay? Plessy versus Ferguson is a key part of this. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then as you continue into the 20th century, you begin to have a focus on offering a broader variety of curriculum options, and then removing legal obstacles to the equality of education. So there's another law that we're going to talk about in a minute that really made a major impact for African Americans to be able to get an education in general, but also a college education. So, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. This one is key. You need to make sure you know this one. This was a Supreme Court ruling that educational facilities are inherently unequal and that laws requiring white and non-white students to go to different schools was illegal. This was where you began to see desegregation. Okay? So, especially at the high school level, it was thought that, well, as long as you have separate but equal facilities, then it's okay to keep whites in one school and non-whites in another school. But the Brown versus Board of Education ruling said separate cannot be equal. Separate facilities cannot be equal facilities or equal educational opportunities. And so, because of that, the Supreme Court said it's illegal to have separate facilities for whites and non-whites. And so this is where we begin to see this desegregation. What you see in the movie Remember the Titans is about this time, and I think it actually takes place maybe a little bit later than this, but you begin to see this desegregation. And you begin to see at the school a bathroom for whites and a bathroom for non-whites. You have a water fountain for whites and a water fountain for non-whites. And you see this idea of just, one group is better than the other group, and just this mentality of, almost hatred because they were different and they didn't like being different. And so the Brown versus Board of Education forced schools to desegregate. Now, continue that into the 60s and even through the 80s, there was controversy over busing, and what's known as the white flight in big cities made desegregation difficult. So you had this controversy over busing students together, especially if it was over a long distance to get the schools together. And so it produced negative effects. You also had sometimes buses being attacked by whites that didn't want the non-whites to be there. And so that became a difficult thing. You also had some whites that said, well, we're all going to go to this other school because they have primarily whites at their school, so we're all going to go there. And so you begin to see whites leaving schools and going to other schools, this white flight, because they didn't want to desegregate. And so that became an issue as well. In your book on page 328, you actually see a picture of a bus basically driving through a little tunnel and trying to get students to a school, and they're surrounded by people. And so there's a little caption there about that, talking about this desegregation effort. Now, the next thing in 1971, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. This ruling backed busing to hasten desegregation. Again, without buses, obviously, it's hard to get students together, and so that was something else that happened. And then from the 1990s to the present, there's almost been a reversal or an end to many desegregation programs. So some of the programs that were designed to start putting students together that were different races, some of those programs have kind of died out. Some of those programs have not been funded. And so what's beginning to happen in some areas is you see a resegregation, especially in large cities, but we even see that in North Mississippi. There are some schools that are primarily African American students, and then you've got some that are primarily white students. And, with very small percentages of the other race. And so there is somewhat of a resegregation that's happening in our schools, and that's not always a good thing. My kids go to a school that doesn't have very many African Americans, and I almost wish they had more, because there's some value in being around people that are different than you are. And they go to school with people that are different than them, but not the same kind of different. And so I tell my kids all the time, well, not my kids, but I tell students and stuff all the time that some of my best friends in high school were not of the same race as me. I mean, I had a friend I played football with that was an African American, and got word that his house had caught on fire. I don't know where I was or what I was doing, but I remember dropping everything, and I'd never been to his house. But I found his house, and I went to his house because I heard his house was on fire. Now, what was I going to do as a 17, 18-year-old kid? Probably nothing. Be there for moral support, be there to do whatever I could. But I felt like I needed to go because this was one of my best friends, and his house was on fire. And so, there's value, at least in my opinion, of being around people that are different than you are. You learn from them. You maybe can be influenced by them or can influence them. You can just learn a lot. I mean, there's so many benefits when our students are able to be around people that are different than they are. Whether that's the way they look, the way they act, where they come from, their culture, whatever, there is value in those differences. And so I really appreciate that, and I want our schools to be desegregated. I want all these groups to come together because I think that does benefit students a ton. And then our last thing, actually we got two more quickly. American Indians, a lot of their education happens on reservations. They receive schooling from missionaries. They now sometimes have their own schools. From the 1890s to 1970s, missionary schools gradually replaced by government boarding schools. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs puts boarding schools up in reservations a lot of times that educates those students. By 1965, American Indians began to demand control of their own schools, and so they wanted to, have control over what's being taught in their schools. And between 1972 and 1975, Congress enacted 3 bills that encouraged the establishment of community-run schools, offering grants to develop culturally relevant and bilingual curriculum materials, and established an advisory council of American Indians. So, Congress during this time was trying to figure out, okay, we're going to let you run your own school, but we may need either your input or we may need to give you input, so we're going to work together. And so today the education of American Indian population is about 530,000 students, but it's plagued by problems such as poverty, parental alcoholism, underachievement, absenteeism, overage students, and high dropout rates. And again, we're not going to get into details about American Indian schools because honestly, I don't know much more than just what's in your book. But I do know that they do have some of these problems within reservations, and so that then filters into the schools and can be quite the problem. And then our last thing is dealing with Hispanics. And we've talked a good bit about Hispanics in our schools when we talked about diversity back in chapter 3. Hispanic children first attended religious mission schools. So again, like a lot of the schools started from a missionary standpoint, a religious standpoint, wanting to educate about religion. And so that's a lot of where they started. The common school of the 19th century and 20th centuries often sealed off opportunities for Hispanics. Because a lot of those schools, because you had so many people say, well, if you're allowed diversity, then you're going to teach people, or you're going to bring in other cultures, and we can't teach our American culture. Today, about 25% of Hispanic students speak mostly Spanish at home. 49% of those have parents with a high school education or higher. So it's only about half. And so again, you can, based on other things we've talked about in this class, you can see the problems that maybe can come from that. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided new support of the education of Hispanics. Again, we've talked about how there were certain laws put into play where you had to provide students that were, that spoke a different language, you had to provide them with opportunities to get the instruction in their language. And that's where the ESL and the ELL, ESL curriculum came in. And so another response has been the establishment of bilingual education programs like ESL to provide students with instruction in their native language, native tongue, at the same time they learn English. And then here's a key thing. Hispanic youth represent the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. So they haven't always been educated, but there's more and more of them that are coming into our schools. And so we have to work to make sure that we are able to educate those students. Now, I hope this has given you an overview of the history of education. This is primarily just a historical overview. You'll have one more chapter. We'll do chapter 11 in our next videos, and then we will be finished with all of our content for this course. So if you have any questions about the history, let me know. The next chapter gets into how education is governed and how it's financed and some of those things. So we'll talk about all of that coming